You owe me this, Dad. After everything I've been through, you owe me this." I stood in my own kitchen, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold 10 minutes ago, looking at my son like I was seeing a stranger. And maybe I was. Maybe I'd been looking at a stranger for years and just refused to admit it. Let me back up. My name is Warren. Warren Cole. I'm 63 years old. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and for most of my adult life, I believed that being a good father meant never letting your kid feel the kind of hunger I felt growing up. Not just the literal kind, though there was plenty of that too, but the hunger of wanting something and knowing it was out of reach before you even started. I grew up in eastern Kentucky. My father worked in the mines until his lungs wouldn't let him anymore, and then he sat in a recliner and watched the years go by. My mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and called it a blessing. We weren't poor in the dramatic way people write about in books. We were just quietly, steadily, invisibly short of everything. New shoes happened once a year. Vacations didn't happen at all. The word college in our house was spoken the same way people speak about winning the lottery, like it was theoretically possible, but had nothing to do with us. I left at 18 with a duffel bag and $200 I'd saved from baling hay the summer before. I drove a truck for 4 years. Then I got my commercial driver's license upgraded, started doing long-haul routes, saved everything I could, and eventually, through a lot of 18-hour days and more black coffee than any human being should consume, I put together enough to buy my first truck outright. Then a second one. By the time I was 42, Coal Freight Solutions had 11 trucks, a small warehouse on the edge of Buncombe County, and a reputation for showing up on time. Every single time. I wasn't rich. I want to be clear about that, but I was comfortable in a way my father never got to be, and that meant something to me. I can't quite put into words even now. My son, Brennan, was born when I was 31. His mother, my ex-wife Joel, and I divorced when he was 9. It wasn't ugly, as divorced when he was 9. It wasn't ugly, as divorces go. We were just two people who had grown into different people, and the kindest thing we could do was admit it. Joel moved to Charlotte. Brennan split his time between us through middle school, and then when he got to high school, he wanted to stay in Asheville full-time, which I understood. His friends were there. His life was there. I tried to be present. I coached his little league team when he was 8. I drove 4 hours round trip every other weekend when he was living with his mother. I went to every graduation, every ceremony, every school play, even when he told me I didn't have to, and financially I gave him everything I hadn't had. Private high school, because the public school in our district wasn't great. A used Toyota Camry when he turned 17 because I didn't want him bumming rides. A full 4 years at NC State, tuition, room, board, spending money, all of it without him taking out a single dollar in loans. I didn't do any of it to be thanked. I want to be honest about that too. I did it because I loved him, and because I had made a decision somewhere along the way that my son would never feel that particular kind of invisible shortage I grew up with. What I didn't understand, and this is the part I've had to sit with, the part that still costs me something to admit, is that in trying to protect him from scarcity, I accidentally taught him something else entirely. I taught him that resources were always available. I taught him that problems had a solution, and that solution usually involved his father making a phone call or writing a check. I taught him, without meaning to, that the flaw would always be there. Brennan graduated from NC State with a business degree in 2015. He moved to Raleigh, got a job at a mid-size marketing firm, and within 3 years had worked his way up to account manager. I was proud, genuinely proud. He was sharp, he was personable, and he had an instinct for reading people that I always thought would take him far. Then he met Courtney. I don't say that to blame her, I really don't. Courtney came from a family in the Research Triangle. Her father was a cardiologist. Her mother ran a non-profit that somehow operated out of a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. They were the kind of people who discussed their investment portfolios at dinner and dropped the names of private clubs the way other people mention restaurants. Brennan loved her. I could see that. And she seemed to love him. But I noticed, in the small ways you notice things when you're paying attention, that being around her family changed something in him. The way he talked about his job started to shift. He stopped calling it what it was, a good solid career at a respectable firm, and started calling it a stepping stone. He started talking about his background differently too. Not lying exactly, just softening things. Rounding up, the truck-driving father from Kentucky became, "My dad runs a regional logistics company." Which was technically true. It just wasn't the full picture. I didn't say anything. What would I say? He was building a life. I understood the impulse to present yourself in the best light. I'd done it myself in my own way when I was young. They got engaged in the fall of 2019. Brennan called me, and I told him I was happy for him, and I meant it. A few weeks later, he and Courtney came to Asheville for a weekend, and we all had dinner at a nice place downtown. And I thought things were fine. Better than fine. The conversation happened a month before the wedding. He called me on a Tuesday evening. I remember because I'd just gotten home from a long day dealing with a broken axle on one of my trucks and a supplier dispute that had eaten up most of my afternoon. I was tired. I poured 2 fingers of bourbon and sat down on the back porch, and that's when my phone rang. He said he needed to talk to me about the wedding seating. I assumed he meant the rehearsal dinner or some logistical thing. I said, "Sure, what's going on?" There was a long pause. The kind of pause that means someone has been rehearsing what they're about to say. "Dad," he said, "Courtney's family has some concerns about optics." I didn't say anything. I waited. The wedding is going to be a pretty formal event. Her parents have a lot of colleagues coming, a lot of people from their circle, and I don't know how to say this without it sounding bad. Then just say it. Another pause. They're worried about how things will look. On your side of the family. And Courtney's aunt, she kind of runs things in that family. She made some comments about how different our backgrounds are, and Courtney thinks it might be better if Brennan. I kept my voice even. "Are you telling me you don't want me at your wedding?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. "It's not that I don't want you there," he said. "It's complicated. Courtney's aunt is very traditional, and I'm your father," I said. "I am your father. I know, Dad, I know. But you have to understand the position I'm in. I understand the position you're in," I said. And then, because I didn't trust what else might come out of my mouth, I said goodnight and I hung up. I sat on that porch for a long time. The bourbon sat untouched. The mountains in the distance were going dark against an orange sky, and I sat there trying to figure out how to feel about what had just happened. I went to the wedding. I want to make that clear. Not in person. I wasn't invited, as established. But I sent a card. I sent a gift off their registry, something tasteful and within a reasonable range, because I wasn't going to let my hurt turn me into someone I didn't recognize. What I didn't do was call. I didn't reach out to explain myself or demand an explanation. I didn't show up on his doorstep. I just stepped back, quietly. The way you step back from something hot. Brennan texted me a thank you for the gift. I replied, "You're welcome. Hope it was a beautiful day." That was the extent of our communication for 4 months. Then, on a Thursday morning in February, my phone rang again. Dad. His voice was different, stripped down in a way I hadn't heard since he was a kid and had broken something he knew he shouldn't have been touching. "I need to talk to you. Can I come up this weekend?" He arrived Saturday afternoon. He looked tired in the way that isn't just physical, the kind of tired that settles into your eyes. He sat down at my kitchen table and he told me what had happened. The marketing firm he'd been working at had lost 2 of its major accounts, and there had been layoffs. Brennan wasn't laid off, but his salary was cut by 22%. At the same time, Courtney's family had apparently expected the young couple to maintain a certain lifestyle. They'd signed a lease on an apartment in North Raleigh that cost more per month than my first truck. They'd booked a honeymoon in the Maldives. They'd joined a country club at Courtney's father's insistence, and the initiation fee alone was $38,000. I didn't say anything yet. I let him talk. He told me they were behind on the club dues, behind on the credit card. They'd taken out a personal loan to cover the gap, and the personal loan had its own payment now. The whole thing had become a kind of financial avalanche, each thing feeding the next. "I need help, Dad," he said. "We need help, Dad," he said. "We need help." I asked him what kind of help. He looked at the table for a moment, then he looked at me. "Your cabin," he said. "I own a cabin up near Weaverville. About 22 acres, sits on a ridge with a view that I'm not going to try to describe because there are no words that would do it justice. I bought it 11 years ago for $420,000. A real estate friend of mine told me recently it would list somewhere between 800,000 and $1 million too, depending on the market. I built a life to afford that cabin. I drove through blizzards in Wyoming and ice storms in Minnesota. I went weeks without sleeping in my own bed. I watched my knuckles crack and bleed in cold loading docks in January because I was too stubborn to wear proper gloves. That cabin is not just a property to me, it's the proof that I did what I set out to do. "You want me to give you the cabin," I said. "Sell it," he said. "We just need enough to clear the debt and get back on solid ground. Then we can rebuild from there." I looked at my son across my kitchen table. He was wearing a fleece vest that probably cost $200. His watch was nicer than anything I owned, and he was asking me to sell the thing I had worked the hardest to earn so that he could continue to fund a life built on other people's expectations. "Brennan," I said slowly, "you didn't invite me to your wedding." His jaw tightened. "Dad, I already told you that was Courtney's aunt. I understand what you told me. I'm just naming what happened." He was quiet. "You were ashamed of me," I said. Not with anger. I want to be clear about that. There was no heat in my voice when I said it. It was just a fact I was stating, the way you'd state the weather. You were ashamed of where I came from, and by extension where you came from. And that's okay. I'm not going to pretend it didn't hurt, because it hurt more than just about anything I can remember, but I'm not going to hold it over you either. "Then help me," he said. "If you're not holding it over me, help me." "That's not how this works," I said. He leaned forward, and that's when he said it, the line that I started this whole thing with, because it was the moment everything became clear to me. "You owe me this, Dad. After everything I've been through, you owe me this." I set down my coffee mug. I took a slow breath, and then I said something I had never said to my son in 32 years of being his father. "I don't owe you anything," I said. "I gave you everything, and there's a difference." He blinked. "I gave you everything because I loved you," I said. "Not because I was paying a debt. I don't have a debt to pay. You didn't ask to be born, and I didn't ask you to be grateful. But Brennan, I need you to hear this. A man who works for something has the right to decide what happens to it. That cabin is mine. I earned it, and I'm not selling it to fund the lifestyle you chose to build on sand." He stared at me. I don't think he'd ever heard me say no before. Not like that. Not cleanly and without a door left open. He left that afternoon without eating dinner. I stood on the front porch and watched his car go down the driveway and turn onto the road, and I felt something I didn't entirely expect. Not guilt, and not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of clarity, like a window had been wiped clean. In the weeks that followed, I did a lot of thinking. About the conversation, obviously, but also about the cabin. About what I wanted to do with it, what it meant, what the right thing to do with something you've built actually is. I had a conversation with my old friend Ray, who'd known me since the trucking days and had watched my whole life unfold from close range. We were sitting on Ray's porch one evening and I told him everything, and when I finished he was quiet for a while and then he said, "What do you actually want, Warren? Not what makes sense, what do you actually?" And I surprised myself with the answer. There's a non-profit in Asheville called Blue Ridge Promise. They work with kids aging out of the foster care system. 18, 19 years old, suddenly legally adults, suddenly expected to navigate everything with no family structure and no financial cushion. A lot of them don't make it. A lot of them end up in cycles that are genuinely hard to break without someone intervening at exactly the right moment. I'd done a small donation to them a few years earlier, just a few $1,000s, and stayed on their mailing list. I'd driven past their main house on Merriman Avenue a dozen times. I'd meant to do more and kept letting it slip. I called their executive director, a woman named Pauline, and I told her what I was thinking. I told her about the cabin, not the whole story, just the relevant parts. 22 acres, rich property, a structure that was in good shape and had been well maintained, and an idea. What if the cabin became a transitional housing program, a place where 2 or 3 young adults aging out of foster care could live for up to 18 months, rent-free, while they got their footing, took classes, found work, built credit, built something, and not just housing. The land could support a small working garden, maybe some workshops, something that connected them to tangible labor in a way that I knew from my own life could be genuinely grounding. Pauline was very quiet on the phone. Then she said, "Mr. Mild, Cole, do you understand what this would do for these kids?" I told her I had a pretty good idea. The legal process took about 4 months. I donated the property outright. No strings, no naming rights. I didn't want my name on anything, with a deed restriction ensuring it would be used for the stated purpose for a minimum of 25 years. I also set up a small endowment funded by a portion of what I would have spent on the cabin's upkeep over the next decade to cover basic operating costs. The total value transferred was somewhere in the range of $900,000. I did not tell Brennan what I had done. He found out the way I might have predicted he'd find out, which is the way things tend to come out in a place like Asheville. Someone told someone who told someone. A woman in his wife's book club apparently knew one of the board members at Blue Ridge Promise and had mentioned the new property donation. Brennan called me about 6 weeks after the transfer was complete. "You gave away the cabin," he said. "I donated it, yes. You, Dad?" "I asked you. I asked you for help, and you said no, and then you gave it away." "I gave it to something I believed in," I said. "That's different from giving it away." There was a long silence on the other end. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something younger, something that reminded me of the boy he used to be before all of this. "I don't understand you," he said. "I really don't." "I know," I said. "I think that's been true for a while." Another silence. "Those kids," I said, "the ones who are going to live up there. They don't have anyone, Brennan. Nobody called ahead and cleared the path for them. Nobody paid for their school or their first car or their security deposit. They're going to show up at 18 years old with a garbage bag of clothes and no idea what comes next, and that cabin is going to give them a place to breathe, to figure something out. That matters to me." He didn't say anything for a long time, and then, very quietly, he said, "I should have invited you to the wedding." I didn't tell him it was okay. It wasn't okay. But I told him I appreciated him saying it, and I meant that. We didn't fix everything in that phone call. You don't fix things like that in a phone call. We kept talking. Slowly, in the months that followed, we started talking more. He and Courtney eventually left the country club. Her father was disappointed, I understand, but the Jews were quietly devastating, their actual finances. They found a smaller apartment in a neighborhood that suited what they actually earned, rather than what they hoped people thought they earned. Brennan got a new job at a smaller firm where he ended up being genuinely valuable, not just a middle link in a long chain. He came back to Asheville about 8 months after the cabin donation. He asked if he could see the place. I called Pauline, and she said of course, and we drove up together on a Saturday morning in October, when the ridge was on fire with color, the way it only gets for about 3 weeks in the fall. There were 2 young men living there at the time. One was 19, working toward his GED. The other was 20, had just started at the community college. They had a garden going in the south-facing clearing I'd always thought about using for something. They were awkward with us at first, the way people are when strangers show up in their space. But Pauline had told them a little about me, and at one point the older of the 2 looked at me and said, "You built this place yourself." I told him I bought it. I didn't build it. But yes, I suppose in the way that mattered, I built it. He nodded slowly, looking out at the view. "Good trade," he said. I looked at my son standing next to me in the October light. He didn't say anything, but something in his face had changed. Softened, maybe. I don't know if he fully understood everything that day, or if understanding something like that is even a single moment rather than a long accumulation of smaller moments. But he put his hand on my shoulder, and I put my hand over his, and we stood there for a while without saying anything, looking out at the mountains, which were doing what mountains always do, which is stand there being exactly what they are regardless of what the people looking at them are going through. I'm not going to tell you I don't miss the cabin. I do. Some mornings I still think about the way the fog sits in the valley below that ridge in November, how it looks like something poured in from somewhere else. I think about the porch and the wood stove and the particular sound of rain on that metal roof, but I think about those two young men in the garden more, and I think about my son's hand on my shoulder, and I think, not to be too neat about it, because life isn't neat, that I got something back that morning I hadn't even known I'd lost. You can hold on to everything you earned and still end up with nothing that matters. I watched my father do that with his pride, his stubbornness, his refusal to ever admit he needed anything from anyone. He died with his walls intact and his hands empty. I decided a long time ago I didn't want to die that way. Some decisions you make consciously, some decisions you make without knowing you've made them, until a 19-year-old kid looks at you on a mountain in October and says, "Good trade," and you realize he's right. It was a good trade. That's all I've got. I've been thinking a lot lately about the word owe. Brennan used it like it was a contract. Like the years of school tuition and car payments and security deposits had been transactions, not love. And now the balance was due. But here's the thing nobody tells you when you're a young father, driving through a Wyoming blizzard, thinking about the life you want to build for your kid, giving too much, too easily, for too long, can quietly teach a person that the world operates on a different set of rules than it actually does. That's not a moral judgment. That's just cause and effect. I created the conditions. Brennan grew into them. And when the conditions finally changed, when I said no for the first time in 32 years, neither of us quite knew how to handle it. That's the part I had to own, not the capping decision. That one I'm at peace with. But the 20 years before it, the open checkbook and the cleared paths and the never letting him feel the weight of anything, that's where my responsibility lived. You can love someone completely and still shortchange them in ways that take decades to surface. What I know now, having stood on that ridge in October, watching two 19-year-olds tend a garden they planted themselves, is that there are really only three things that stay with a person once everything else gets stripped away. The first is whether they know right from wrong in the small, quiet moments when no one's watching. The second is whether they can think their way through a hard situation without flinching. The third is whether they've ever had to push through something genuinely difficult and come out the other side knowing they did it themselves. Character, judgment, resilience, those three things. You can't buy them for someone. You can't hand them over in an envelope. The only way they develop is through friction, through the experience of wanting something and having to work for it, of failing and figuring out what comes next. I didn't give Brennan enough of that friction. I thought I was being a good father, and I was in some ways. The love was real, the intention was right. But love without limits isn't wisdom. It's just sentiment with a price tag that comes due later. The young man who looked out at that Asheville ridge and said good trade, he hadn't been given everything. He'd been given almost nothing, and he was building anyway. That kind of building changes you in a way that being handed things simply cannot. I watched his face that morning, and I recognized something in it that I hadn't seen in my own son's face in a long time. A particular kind of quiet confidence that comes not from having enough, but from knowing you can figure out how to get there. Brennan is getting there, slowly, the way real things happen. He's working harder now, living closer to what he actually earns, starting to understand that a life built on what other people think of you is about as stable as a house on a hill after 3 days of rain. He's not there yet, but he's moving in the right direction, and that's all any of us can really ask of ourselves on any given day. The cabin is someone else's floor now, and I find that I sleep fine.